Hi everybody, welcome to your first session like this. So this is my attempt to go through exam question content and then set you a homework that is on the exam question so that we have lots of practice doing our exam style questions. So we have got in front of us a 16 marker for the Elizabeth paper. This is also the one where you get 3 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So our question for today is study interpretation 1. How far do you agree with the interpretation that Elizabeth had little connection to the Wyatt plot? That should be a question mark because it says how far do you agree? So the first thing that we need to do is to read the interpretation. So it says, Interpretation 1, J.E. Neal, an historian who specialised in Tudor history, writing in his biography, Queen Elizabeth, published in 1934. Mary had no doubts about Elizabeth's involvement in the plot, and if this could be proved, there was small hope of mercy. Wyatt and others were examined and re-examined for evidence to convict her. It was discovered that Wyatt had twice written to her and received answers, but they were verbal only and amounted to nothing. They may not even have been hers, for some of her servants had been involved in the conspiracy, and there is no saying what use they had made of her name. Okay, so that's the interpretation that we are using today. So when you are writing your 16 marks for this question, there are 5 steps that you need to take. I'm going to be going through each of these steps in turn, so that we are able to then combine this together to make sure that we have got our full answer. So our first step is that we need to outline the interpretation given in the source. So we need to basically state what is the interpretation talking about and does it have a clear stance one way or the other. So when I'm reading this interpretation, what I've done is I've highlighted areas that are of interest that I'm going to write about in this first paragraph. So first of all of interest is that Mary had no doubts about Elizabeth's involvement in the plot. And also that it was discovered that Wyatt had twice written to her and received answers. That's to Elizabeth that Wyatt had written. So both of these sentences suggest that Elizabeth was involved in the Wyatt plot. So we can write our sentences that state, J.E. Neal with this interpretation indicates that there may have been some involvement from Elizabeth. This is evidenced by Mary having no doubts that Elizabeth was involved and through the discovery that Wyatt had twice written to Elizabeth and received answers. I've then moved on and I've got this statement in blue, verbal only and amounted to nothing. The reason I've got that in blue is because in this interpretation, it's made quite clear that the evidence collected against Elizabeth was quite weak. Because it was verbal only and amounted to nothing, there was no, basically the courts could not find Elizabeth guilty. And I think that this is an important thing to write about in our paragraph 1, because we just want to simply write that the evidence was all superficial and actually was not able to be used against Elizabeth. Our final statement I've put in green, that's because this is where J.E. Neal is actually kind of stating that Elizabeth was not to blame, or maybe other people were to blame using her name. So it states that it might have been servants who had been involved in the conspiracy. So overall, in this statement, the word I'm going to use is ambiguous. It's not clear from J.E. Neal whether Elizabeth was involved. We've got some suggestion that she was, and we've got some suggestion that she wasn't. We also have it very clear that the evidence does not prove to us that she was or was not involved because it was verbal. So that is a brief summary of what you need to put together for step 1. So you need to outline what it's talking about and state whether there's a clear stance. What is it arguing for? What is it arguing against? In step 2, you need to provide some context. So for example, what do you know about the event? What information can you add that is either agreeing or disagreeing with this content? So it says in the question, this is about Elizabeth's involvement to the Wyatt plot. So the Wyatt plot is in 1554. So we can put here in this bullet point for our evidence, or rather our context, sorry, that this is happening in 1554. So this is whilst Mary I is Queen of England. Can't type. So we've got, what religion was Elizabeth? She was Protestant. And why was this a threat to Mary? Well, Mary is Catholic, and she has gone back on Edward VI's Protestant claims. So she has reinstated a Catholic England. So the reason why Elizabeth is a threat is because Mary has no heir. So the next in line to the throne is Elizabeth, a Protestant. Additionally, what was Mary about to do that was unpopular with much of the country? Hint involves Spain. She was about to marry Philip II. Philip II becomes king of Spain, a Catholic country. And it's really this point here that is very fundamental for our question. Oh, it's about to happen again. I'm not very good at using this. So it's this point here that's really important for our question, because Wyatt was very, very, very against the Spanish government. And so were many people in England. They did not want the Spanish to be involved in English politics. And they were worried that Philip II would take advantage of Mary and would in effect run England instead of Mary. That was kind of the worry. Some additional questions here. Why would some of Mary's advisors want her to believe Elizabeth was involved? Well, basically, that's almost the same question as why was Elizabeth a threat? It's because Elizabeth was a threat to Catholicism. They hoped, if found guilty, she would be killed. So Mary's advisors are really sort of, well, some of Mary's advisors are really sort of anti-Elizabeth and are really hoping that she will be found guilty and therefore removed from the equation. Got a question here. Why might Elizabeth maintain her innocence? All the way through this, Elizabeth maintains that she's innocent. She's got nothing to do with Wyatt. One of the reasons she does this is because if she admits that she is guilty, she will be put to death. She is being accused of treason. The punishment for treason is execution. So Elizabeth is unlikely at any point to say, yes, I did this, because she is going to maintain her innocence. She is found not to be guilty and she is released from the Tower of London. However, the government of Mary is still sceptical and wary of Elizabeth. And so she gets put under sort of close monitoring at Woodstock House in Oxfordshire. So even though she's found not guilty, it's clear that Mary and her advisors still think that Elizabeth was involved and therefore spend a lot of time watching her movements. So it's very clear from this moment on that Elizabeth has to be very careful with what she does. So in this section, this step 2, what you need to do is provide a short summary of that information so that you are clearly showing the examiner the knowledge that you have for this context. For step number 3, you need to comment about the authorship of the person who wrote the interpretation. This is a bit of a pattern to this section, or there is a bit of a pattern to this section. And once you learn this pattern, paragraph 3 for this question will become quite robotic, and you'll always be able to sort of create this paragraph because you'll be so used to it. So the first thing you need to think about is who wrote it and what is their job. So in this paragraph, you would write the author of the interpretation is J.E. Neal, an historian who specialised in Tudor history. Now, the reason why it's important that he's a historian specialised in Tudor history, is that you can make the assumption that they have studied history to such a degree that they have become an expert in it. And by being an expert in it, it means that the knowledge they have about this time period will likely be based upon years of academic research. That is important. If it states that he's a historian, that means he's been accepted as somebody who has studied history and has therefore exposed themselves to academic literature about this topic. It says he's writing this biography, Queen Elizabeth, published in 1934. So the fact he's writing in 1934 means that he's writing with the benefit of hindsight. So this means that it's likely he would have reached a judgment based on extensive evidence. He's not going to be writing at the time and therefore heavily convinced either by a Catholic or a Protestant agenda. He is removed from the situation, meaning that he can now interpret the sources based upon the ones that he considers to be the most convincing. He's got hindsight. He's removed from the events as they were happening. That's all that you need to do in that paragraph. You just state who wrote it, what their job was, and whether they've written in hindsight. Moving on to step 4, so this is your 4th paragraph. For this one, this is, I think, the part of this question that's the trickiest part. I think the other 3 steps are relatively easy once you've got the hang of them. I think this one's a bit harder. So for step 4, you need to basically be writing, why is it other people may have come to different conclusions? Why might it be other historians have written a different book? And one of the, I would say, easiest ways in the Elizabeth modules is to think about how might Catholics interpret the events and how might Protestants interpret the events. Because Catholic historians would likely give more credit to sources that are pro-Mary, and Protestant historians are more likely to give credit, to give strength to the Protestant, the Elizabeth stronger sources. So I've put some statements here that you could use in this paragraph. So for a Catholic interpretation, historians that are more Catholic leaning, they might argue that we all know how intelligent Elizabeth was. We know she was successful at using factions. We know she was manipulative when she was queen. So if she was manipulative when she was queen, it's quite likely that she was intelligent and manipulative before she became queen. And so Catholic historians might use this as a statement to say it is very obvious that Elizabeth was involved. The fact that there is no evidence suggests she was involved because she's intelligent enough to kind of know what evidence would get her to be guilty and what evidence would let her off the hook. That's what some Catholic historians might argue. On the other hand, Protestant historians, they might actually say, do you know what? Neil is not successfully discussing the evidence that Wyatt did not admit that Elizabeth was involved even after being heavily tortured. This is fact. Wyatt was tortured and did not name Elizabeth. And Protestants would say, or some Protestants might say, this is evidence enough that Elizabeth was innocent. Under extreme torture, her name was not said. Also, Wyatt maintains his innocence when he's being executed. He gives a speech that basically states that Elizabeth was not involved. And Protestants would look towards these arguments as a way to kind of say Elizabeth was not involved. So what step 4 is doing is it's saying, can people have arguments that state different to what Neil is writing about? And finally, in your step 5, you need to come to a conclusion and a reasoned judgment. So you need to weigh up the interpretation that Neil wrote against those possibilities from the Protestant or the Catholic sources. I would say it's fairly good that this source remains ambiguous. It gives both sides of the story, gives both possibilities. It's only a short quotation there, for it lacks the full context. And this final quote at the bottom is your golden quote. that I want to see. This interpretation should therefore be viewed as part of the wider historical debate, which includes a range of differing viewpoints.